In Chapter 16, we talk about proteins and amino acids. Proteins are made up of small amino acids that are combined into a chain and then interacting with the surroundings to form the proteins. There's 20 different of these amino acids. You will not have to memorize the 20 of them, but you will have to look at the characteristics that they might have. For instance, if something is polar, it would interact with water, but you have to be able to know which one would be polar and which one wouldn't, and we're going to talk about that. Proteins in general make up a lot of different functions in the body. This is a list of the functions. These 7 things are all the things that proteins can do. For instance, they transport. Hemoglobin transports oxygen, lipoproteins transports lipids. There are hormones in our body, there are enzymes to make chemical reactions occur. There's 7 different categories that they can be put in. My suggestion to you is to make flashcards with the class of protein on one side and then the function on the other side. That way you know to memorize those 7 different classes. It may also be beneficial to look at the different examples that they give with those classes. Amino acids are the building blocks of the proteins. In other words, they're the things that link together to create the proteins. So let's take apart the word amino acid. Amino derived by the word amine, which we learned in the previous chapters, is a nitrogen group. There's our amine in amino acid. The acid part is a carboxylic acid. And here it is here. So for amino acid, we have an amine and a carboxylic acid. Remember, this is the exact same thing as a double bonded oxygen and an OH group. All of these things are bonded to the alpha carbon, the central carbon. They also have an R group, and this R group is what's determining one amino acid to the next. It's also determining a lot of the physical and chemical characteristics of it. And that's the thing that's going to change. Here are some examples of amino acids. Notice they each have an amine on one side and a carboxylic acid on the other. It's this part in yellow that keeps changing. That's the R group. Also notice in every single one of these, we have a plus and a minus. Rather than NH2, we have NH3. Instead of COOH, we have just COO with a minus sign. That's called the Zwitter ion. They realize when they're in a particular pH, instead of being neutral like they originally thought, they actually ended up having charges on either side, which will increase the reactivity of it and the connecting from one compound to the next. So notice NH2, when they gain a hydrogen to NH3, it becomes a positive 1. COOH, the carboxylic acid, when it loses that hydrogen, becomes a minus 1. The overall charge is still 0. They balance out. However, you have a positive and a negative there, instead of it being neutral on both sides. So let's look at these chains, these R groups. There's nonpolar R groups and there's polar R groups. Let's take a look at hydrophobic and hydrophilic and what that means. If we break down those words, hydro means water. Phobic means a fear. So nonpolar compounds are hydrophobic because they have a fear of water. There's no because it's not polar, there's no interaction with water. In fact, it tries to get away from water. It beads up on water. If you notice in the rain, oil will float on top of the water and it beads up. That's because it's trying to get away from the water. There's no pluses and minuses to interact with it. Whereas polar is hydrophilic. Hydro, once again, means water. Philic means an affinity or likes water or loves water, attracted to water, however you want to say it. That's because there's a positive or a negative charge in it. Some form of electronegativity. Notice with the polar one that they gave an example of, there's an oxygen and a nitrogen. Both of those, if we look on the periodic table, both of those are close to fluorine. As a result, they're more electronegative, which means that they're going to be attracting electrons. So that means it's going to be partially negative up here, which means it'll interact with the hydrogen that's partially positive in water. And so there's going to be an interaction there, making it more hydrophilic, making it dissolve in water. Whereas here, with the nonpolar one, there's nothing but carbon and hydrogen. You'll notice that as a trend. There are typically nothing besides carbon and hydrogen. If there is, there's a lot of carbons to balance it out. So if you look here, look at all the yellow ones, there's nothing but carbons and hydrogens here. On the bottom row, there's a couple of them, sulfur here and nitrogen here. All the rest of them are carbon and hydrogens. The ones with the two have a lot of carbons to even it out. So that's what you're going to be looking for when you're looking for whether or not it's polar. Polar molecules, however, all have something besides carbon and hydrogen. That's giving it an electronegative edge, which is making it want to interact with the hydrogen in the water. Now if we look at acidic and basic, both of those will interact with water. Which is why they call it hydrophilic. Remember, hydro is water, philic is an affinity or an attraction to water. Notice whether it's acid or base, it doesn't matter because of the fact that there's a charge there. It's going to interact with water. This just happens, this is negative, so it's going to interact with the hydrogen. This is positive, so it's going to interact with the oxygen. It's considered acidic because notice that this is a carboxylic acid without that hydrogen. It's basic because of this nitrogen accepted that hydrogen there. Here are some more examples of the acidic. Once again, carboxylic acid here. And here's the basic. Has the nitrogen in it that accepts the hydrogen. So let's take a look. Which one's polar and which one's nonpolar? Well, no matter what, amino acids have to have the amines and they have to have the carboxylic acid, so we do not consider that. They also have a hydrogen there, so one of these hydrogens don't matter. The other hydrogen is what, in this group here, is what we're going to look at. Because this is carbon, only carbon and hydrogen, which specifically hydrogen, it is not polar. Because there's an oxygen here, that's making this polar. There are 10 amino acids that you need that we do not create in our bodies, yet we need them for our cellular processes. The word essential is given to these amino acids because it is essential for, think of it as being essential for us to consume it. We have to eat it. our bodies don't make it. So that means that we have to eat these amino acids in order to do our basic day-to-day stuff, in order for our bodies to survive. Notice it changes as we get older. Those are needed for children and not for adults. Remember, our nutritional needs change as we get older. And just to give you some idea, if you have a patient who happens to be a vegetarian, that means that they might have issues with these amino acids. You may hear that vegetarians don't get the proteins that they need. Well, this is what they're referring to. If you eat meats, you're getting the protein that you need. However, your diet might be lacking in some areas if you don't. And even if you eat tofu, which is soy, you might still be getting a deficiency. So make sure that your patients that are vegetarians are taking the vitamins that they need so that their bodies can function properly. And that is the introduction to amino acids and proteins.